Very few people realize at this late date the important part played by the old-time trail drivers towards civilization and development of the great state of Texas. At the close of the Civil War, the soldiers came home broke, and our state was in a deplorable condition. The old men, small boys, and Negroes had taken care of the stock on the ranges, and the state was overstocked, but there was no market for their stock. In 1867 and 1868, some of our most venturesome stockmen took a few small herds of cattle to New Orleans, Baxter Springs, Abilene, Kansas, and other markets. The northern drives proved fairly successful, though they experienced many hardships and dangers going through an uncivilized and partly unexplored country. The news of their success spread like wildfire, and the same men and others tackled the trail in 1869. At that time, it was not a question of making money. It was a question of finding a market for their surplus stock at any price. There was very little money in the country, and no banks or trust companies to finance the drives. In this great undertaking, some of them drove their own stock and others buying on credit to pay on their return, giving no other security than a list of brands and amounts due. The 1869 drives proved successful, which caused many other stockmen to join the trail drivers in 1870. By this time, going up the trail was all a rage. 1870 was a banner year at all the markets. The drivers came home and began preparing for the 1871 drives. Excitement ran high. There was never such activity in the stock business before in Texas. Drivers were scouring the country, contracting for cattle for the next spring delivery, buying horses and employing cowboys and foremen. Many large companies were formed to facilitate the handling of the fast-growing business. Capital had been attracted from the money centers, and financial arrangements to pay for the stock as received in the spring were made. Thus opened the spring of 1871. Also all the drivers increasing the number of herds previously driven, and many companies and individuals driving 10 to 15 herds each. Imagine all the ranchmen in southeast and middle Texas at work at the first sign of spring, gathering and delivering trail herds. This work generally lasted from April 1st to May 15th. The drivers would receive, road brand, and deliver a herd to their foreman, supply them with cash or letters of credit, give the foreman and hands instructions, and say, "Adios, boys. I will see you in Abilene, Dodge, Ellsworth, Ogallala, Cheyenne, or whatever point was the destination of the herd. Then riding day and night to the next receiving point, going through the same performance, then on to the next, until all herds were started up the trail. Some of the drivers would go on the trail, others would go by rail or boat to the markets, lobby around waiting for their herds, sometimes going down the trail several hundred miles to meet their herds, often bringing buyers with them. I made my first trip up the trail in 1871 for Choate and Bennett. John Bennett, Sr., was a member of the firm. They sent 14 herds up the trail that year. Dunk Choate, now deceased, counted and delivered this herd to Jim Byler, our boss, on the Cibolo near Stockdale, Wilson County, pointed our herd north and left, saying, "You boys know the rest. I must leave you and receive other herds." The first few years there was no market for cow ponies at the cattle markets. In 1871 we brought back over the trail 150 cow ponies and several chuck wagons from Abilene, Kansas, belonging to Choate and Bennett and W.C. Butler. But later, after ranches were established throughout the Northwest, those ranchmen learned that our Spanish ponies were better for the range work than their native horses. And after that, cow ponies were ready sail, and the cowboys came home by rail or boat. Later, there was a demand for Texas brood mares. This proved a bonanza for Texas ranchmen, as our ranges were overstocked with them, and they were almost worthless. I drove 1,002 herds to Dodge City in 1884. It was claimed that 100,000 went up the trail that year, and more than 1,000,000 went up the trail from the time the horse market opened until the trail closed. 1871 was not a successful year, but it did not prevent a grand rush for the 1872 drive. Some of the drivers had made government contracts to supply Indian agencies. Some had contracts with Western ranchmen for stock cattle and young steers. Others driving on the open market. 1872 proved a successful year, which caused a great rush for the 1873 drive. Those that sold early had contracts or got tips from the money centers did fairly well, but a panic clogged the wheels of commerce. Some sold at heavy losses. Some wintered herds, thinking a steer in good condition could live where a buffalo could. A cold winter and a sleet-covered range caused many losses. The 1874 drive was lighter and profitable, which caused a larger drive in 1875. Those losers in 1873 patched up weak places and were on the trail again. Such men would not stay broke. By this time, the drivers had become acquainted with the Western ranchmen. Large companies were formed, and many large ranches were established in the Indian Territory and the northwestern ranges. The drives continued, but they did not always have smooth sailing. The market fluctuated. Some had heavy losses from losing stock on the trail on account of droughts, late spring, cold weather, and many other causes. During all these years, the Texas ranchmen were not idle. With the proceeds of cattle sold to trailmen, they were able to improve their stock, establish new ranches, all the time pushing west and forcing the natives before them. At the close of the war, all the country west of an airline from Eagle Pass to Gainesville was uncivilized and sparsely settled. Every ranch or village above this line was subject to an Indian raid every moon. The government had a string of posts across the state above this line, but the Indians made many raids between these posts, murdered men, women, and children, stole stock, and made their escape without seeing a soldier. The soldiers did their best, but the cunning natives generally outwitted them. The trailers and ranchmen were the most dreaded enemies of the Indians, and Texas Rangers next, most of the Rangers being former cowboys. The natives were forced back slowly but surely by the trailer and ranchmen, and were finally forced into the mountains of New Mexico, Old Mexico, and Arizona, their number being reduced to a small band led by the notorious Geronimo, chief of the Apaches, which was captured by the government troops in 1885. This ended Indian depredations in Texas. The cooperation of the trailers, ranchmen, and rangers with the government troops accomplished this great feat, but the most credit belongs to the old-time trail driver, the starter and finisher of the destiny of this great state, and the men that blazed the way that led to many great commercial enterprises. Besides stocking and causing to be stocked the ranges from the Rio Grande to British possessions, that before that time were a desert, not bringing a cent of revenue to the state's treasury, inhabited by wild animals and natives. From 1885, the drives were lighter up to 1895, when the trail, which had been used 27 years, was closed. Nothing like it and its far-reaching accomplishment ever happened before and will never happen again. It is estimated by the most conservative old-time trail drivers that an average of 350,000 cattle were driven up the trails from Texas each year for 28 years. 9 million, 800,000 cattle at $10 a head, made $98 million received by the ranchmen at home. 1 million horse stock at $10 per head, received by the ranchmen at home, making $10 million, or a total of $108 million. This vast amount sounds like a European war loan, but it was not. It was all caused by a few fearless men making the start in 1867 or 1868. No one had any idea that the cattle, the staple product, would blossom out thus and bring such prosperity to our state and heap so much glory on the heads of the old-time trail men. The circulation of the billions of dollars produced by the industry, passing as it did directly into channels that were opened to receive it, produced the prosperity that has been in evidence in Texas for so many years. The cowman, the merchant, the farmer, the day laborer profited thereby, and the vast volume of gold that flowed through these channels is absolutely incomprehensible. Had these old-time trail drivers not looked for and found this market, our vast herds would have died on the ranges, and the vast unstocked ranges would have lain dormant and unproductive. Our ranchmen would have left Texas disgusted and broke, and it would have been a difficult matter to re-inhabit our state. Therefore, development would have been checked for many years. Possibly no iron horse would have reached the Rio Grande up to this time, as the inducement would not have been attractive.